Introduce our speakers. We have Lindsay Edelman, and she's a water conservation rep with EB Mud. Lindsay is going to be presenting today. She has been with EB Mud for the past 2 years, and before joining EB Mud, she was a water conservation representative with the city of Santa Cruz. Rolando Gonzalez is doing our interpretation today, and Rolando has been with the East Bay Mud Water Conservation for the past 10 years. He focuses primarily on the commercial, working with commercial customers. So for our agenda, we're going to have an overview of irrigation components, then take a look at drip irrigation in detail, how to audit an irrigation system, common irrigation problems and solutions, and irrigation rebates.
Thank you so much, Kristen. This is Lindsay, and I'll be leading your Irrigation Basics webinar for today. So we're going to start with just an overview of what a typical irrigation system can look like. This is to give people with existing irrigation systems an idea of all the different crazy components, or what can seem crazy. And also for maybe people who are at this webinar thinking of installing new irrigation equipment or setting something up. So irrigation systems are designed with many components and can seem really complicated, but they're designed with a lot of good thought and intent. And that doesn't always get passed down to the homeowner or renter or person who's using the irrigation system. But the good news is you don't need to be an irrigation designer to understand how these things all work together. The intent of this webinar is to show you piece by piece how all the irrigation components work together and what you can do to make sure that it is running efficiently. And you can see this with this overview irrigation system on the ground. Having a good context of all the different components is going to help you understand what to look for when you're auditing your irrigation system, as well as thinking of fine-tuning things and adding new equipment. So we're going to take a start by looking at the first 5 basic components that you'll find on most irrigation systems. We may go throughout this webinar, we might go over some equipment that does not exist on your irrigation system. And that's perfectly fine, because some of these things aren't appropriate for your irrigation system due to the age, design, or type of irrigation system that you may have, or you may decide that you want to start updating some things. So we're going to get started with those basic irrigation components. The first component is the East Bay Mud meter. This is your connection to the water distribution center system, which is then teed off by a point of connection. After this point of connection, there's going to be a manual shutoff valve. And this can either be in the form of a gate valve or a ball valve. And this allows you to shut off water by serving the irrigation. This is typically located at the main hose bib line that connects to your house. Following the manual shutoff valve, you may have a backflow prevention device. A backflow prevention device protects irrigation water from contaminating potable drinking water supply. There are other forms as well besides the one in the first picture. Kristen, if you press the next couple pictures. Yeah. So we also have a check valve and an anti-siphon valve. So there's different types of backflow that can occur at different parts of your irrigation system, but for the purpose of the overview that we were showing, I just wanted to include that one as well. After the backflow prevention device, you may have a pressure regulator. This reduces outlet water pressure serving your irrigation water and can improve performance and longevity of an irrigation system. So looking at where this actually occurs on your irrigation system, you can see that these are really important components. So and they control major features. So they're gonna occur at the very start of your irrigation system so that you can shut off water if you need to at the very start. The backflow prevention device is preventing all of the water from being siphoned back into the distribution system, and the pressure regulator is regulating the pressure for the entire system. Now, these next components are, nice to haves, not needs to haves. They typically are found on larger commercial or residential landscapes. So they might not be appropriate, but I figured we should talk about them because they could be something that you would want in the future or could be interesting. So the first thing is a private irrigation submeter. A submeter does essentially what the East Bay mud meter is doing. It's measuring the water that goes through your meter, except for it's specific to irrigation. This can be really helpful in detecting leaks and understanding how much your irrigation is using. We do have a rebate available for this. After your private irrigation submeter, if you have a large landscaping on automatic irrigation, you'll have a master valve, which is a closed valve that's installed upstream of your individual valves. The purpose of the master valve is that it prevents malfunctioning valves from wasting water when the system is not running. Essentially, what happens is the flow sensor, which detects flows and sends an electrical current to the master valve, will send a notice, and then the master valve will close when a leak is occurring. And then this is all happening upstream above your automatic irrigation valves. Your automatic irrigation valves correspond to the number of zones or stations programmed in your irrigation controller. So now let's take a look at where this would actually occur on your irrigation system. So you can see that if you were to have a submeter, typically that would be installed close to the point of connection, because that's where you want to be measuring all of the water that's going through the irrigation line. Your master valve is occurring before your individual irrigation valve, so it can shut everything off if needed. And then the flow sensor is close behind because it's sending a notification to that master valve to shut it off. So now that we've gone over the main components that you see before the valves, we'll take a look at what you're going to see after the valves. These pieces should probably be pretty familiar, so that's a good thing. But we'll start with some vocabulary here. Some of the words I'll be saying, like the word throw, which is meaning how far the water can reach when irrigating. Precipitation rate, meaning the amount of water that's being emitted from a sprinkler. This doesn't always mean this is actually what's being received on the plant's roots ends, but it's really talking about what that piece of equipment is designed to emit. And then PSI, which is a measurement of water, which is pounds per square inch, where there are two types of pressure, static or operating. But in the purpose of this presentation, we're really going to be talking about operating PSI. So the most common type of sprinkler you'll see are fixed sprinklers. They have a throw of up to 17 feet with a precipitation rate of up to 2 inches per hour, and they're designed to operate at 30 PSI. These are your standard sprinklers, but there is a more efficient type of sprinkler, which is a rotating sprinkler. What makes them more efficient is that they have a further throw rate with a lower precipitation rate. Having a lower precipitation rate means that there's lower amount of water being applied with larger droplets, designed to operate at a higher pressure. So this provides more uniform coverage and larger droplets and prevents pressure-related issues like misting. We do have a rebate available for this. The next type of spray that you could see on your lawn or part of your landscaping are rotors. These are designed for irrigating large spaces like fields or agriculture, and they have a really high throw rate of up to 100 feet, but a low precipitation rate. One thing to keep in mind with rotors are that as they get old, they tend to get stuck or overwater one area. if I ever go out and do an audit and see some rotors on someone's landscaping, I typically advise them to remove them and replace them with high efficiency nozzles so that they can accurately irrigate the area that they're going to be irrigating, as opposed to hitting a fence or, irrigating some unnecessary sidewalk. Now, the next type of irrigation is drip irrigation, which is a micro irrigation system that drips slowly, specifically at the root zone, and minimizes evaporation. It's used for growing food, raised beds, shrubs, trees, and narrow spaces. One important thing to keep in mind with drip is with the emitters, there are different emitter rates. And these different emitter rates are specific to different types of soil that you may have. For example, if you live in Alameda, you're more likely to have sandy soil, which would mean that you would want a larger emitter rate because the water is able to penetrate that soil more and reach lower. Whereas if you live somewhere more in the East Bay where your soil tends to be more loamy, it's like a sponge that fills up a bit quicker. So you're going to want a slower gallon per hour emitter rate so that you don't have water running off. And now we'll go into different types of drip irrigation. So no matter what type of drip irrigation that you have, you will have some form of filter and pressure regulation. It's really important to have these devices on your irrigation valve for drip because it's required for optimal performance and prevents emitters from being blown off the distribution tubing. The optimum pressure for your drip irrigation would be 30 psi. And I don't know if you remember before, but we were talking about spray heads that required PSI of, 40, 50, much significantly higher. So this just shows that, having those smaller tubing, the emitter rates, emitting water at gallons per hour really requires a significantly lower pressure, which is why it requires its own pressure regulator on it individually. So the first type of drip irrigation that you could see in your landscaping are bubblers, which apply water at a high rate to a small radius. So imagine like a fruit tree or large shrubs, trees. This is a preferred type of drip irrigation for that because of the high flow rate and larger amounts of water that are coming out of that shrub bubbler. The next type is point source drip, which is also called spaghetti tubing. The benefit of this drip is you can have multiple emitters and install them where you like along the tube. And you can change things around as your plants begin to establish themselves. One caveat with this type of drip irrigation is that because of the nature of the spaghetti tubing, the emitters can burst off. So when you're auditing your irrigation, that's something that you're going to want to be checking. The last type of drip is inline drip, where the emitters are actually located inside of the drip line. So this can be beneficial because it prevents emitters from being blown off. However, the caveat with this is that the emitters are placed every 6, 12, or 18 inches. So this is really only preferable for grid layouts of landscaping. If you have plants that are spaced out, matching those emitter spacings. One thing about drip that's different than spray is it can be really hard to find leaks, but there are drip leak indicators which pop up or mist when water is going through your drip line. So if you're seeing these little drip leak indicators misting when no water should be running, that indicates that there is some form of leak or water running through your drip line. So that would be a good thing to install to help you manage your drip irrigation lines. And now is the time for questions.
Okay, I seem to have low pressure. Is this something that EB Mud can come out and check?
So low pressure can be checked. We do have field staff who can provide assistance with that. So if you call the East Bay Mud number, which is 1-866-EB-MUD, you can request getting some help on that.
What is the best way to find static pressure on a private residence?
So to find out static pressure, you would want to essentially get a pressure gauge and install it to one of your hose bibs. We also have this information at East Bay Mud where we can actually know what your pressure, average pressure could be. So that's information that can also be provided from us, but it's best to do it locally at your home with a pressure gauge.
Okay, other questions were about, we are going to be sending out a follow-up email with a link to these presentations. Can we include a mixed drip irrigation and above ground sprinklers on the same irrigation line?
When you say irrigation line, are you meaning the same zone, or are you meaning just off the same irrigation line, many different zones? Because those are two kind of different things. If you're seeing drip irrigation and spray, sprinklers on the same zone, as in, when you're turning on zone 1, those both things are running, that's going to be a huge problem because those have different pressure needs. So you're not going to be adequately irrigating what you need to irrigate. If you have them on two separate zones, like you have zone 1 is for your veggie garden and zone 2 is for your lawn, and the lawn is on sprinklers and the drip is the drip is just for the veggie garden on a different zone, that would be fine, because as long as that pressure regulator is installed on the appropriate valve, it's not going to be affecting the other valve or zone. It's not going to affect the sprinklers. So hopefully that answered your question.
How can I tell where my irrigation system is off my main water supply?
So you should be able to it depends on the house, but typically if you know where your service line is, going into your house, typically your irrigation will tee off of that. So your main hose bib that goes to the front of the house, that's typically where that irrigation line will be, that point of connection.
There's a few other questions, but I think we'll move on and see if some of these questions get answered through your presentation, and then we'll also have a time to discuss it at the end.
Great. So now that we've gone over different components in your irrigation system that you might be encountering or may decide would be good to install, let's talk about what you should be focusing on right now before spring to prep your irrigation system. The first being turning on your controller, checking the settings, assessing what the run times are the date and time correct? And are there still batteries in there, and are the batteries good? So in case something were to lose power, that you would still be able to irrigate when you needed to at the right time. Also, flushing out your irrigation system to remove dirt. We'll go more in detail with that. You're going to want to turn on your valves, walk around, listen to any water that could be leaking out of those drip tubes, feeling your soil if it's dry in some areas or too soggy in another, and then flagging those issues and correcting them as needed. So this is East Bay Mud's lawn and landscape watering schedule. We're going to be emailing this out later, but for those of you who manually adjust your controller, this would be a good guide to take a look at when you're doing your preseason checkup and turning things on to see where's your controller at. Likely it was probably not set to March. It's probably somewhere around October or maybe July if you don't adjust it as quickly. So you're going to want to make sure that it's representative to what's going on right now. So you can see for March, we've got, if you've got a lawn, you're only going to really be wanting to irrigate it 1 day a week at most. And your other types of shrubs and low water plants probably don't need anything yet. And that's because we'll still be receiving some precipitation. The amount of daylight that we're having is not as substantial as it is in the summer. So your plants' needs aren't as great. But one thing to keep in mind is also that weather can change. So you always want to be keeping in mind what is March typically versus what's the current March that we're having. And I'm hoping it'll be a miracle March this year. So the next thing you're going to want to do is, flushing out your filter and your system. So to flush out your system, you're going to want to be doing it manually. So typically you'll be doing that from your irrigation valve. So when you open up your irrigation valve box, it can be really intimidating, but we're going to go over a couple of things that you might see and what's really necessary for flushing out your irrigation system. So you've got some wires, and those wires are connected to your solenoids. And what the wires do are they send an electric pulse to that solenoid to turn on. So it's connected to your controller and it's saying, hey, irrigation zone, wake up. And then below that is the actual valve, which gets opened by the solenoid. For manually flushing out your system, you're going to want to righty tighty, lefty loosey that bleed port that we're seeing in that red circle. Another component in this picture that you're seeing that's a nice to have but not a need to have is in the right corner. That's also a flush valve that is used to flush out the whole system as well. And yeah, so we'll go to the next slide. So now that we've identified what you need to do to your valve to help with the flushing, let's talk about how you flush out sprinklers and drip. So for sprinklers, you're going to want to remove the sprinkler head furthest away from your valve. And you're going to want to be cautious about this because you want to make sure that you've either dug around this area or you have enough clearance so that you're not accidentally getting dirt into your sprinkler body as you're flushing it out. So just be careful with that. And you're going to want to flush it for 30 seconds and then turn it off and reinstall the sprinkler. Additionally, you're also going to want to clean out each sprinkler nozzle individually because they have a mesh screen that also gets clogged with dirt and debris. Now for the drip irrigation system, at the end of your drip lines, there'll be a flush valve or an end cap. You're either going to want to open that flush flush valve or remove the end cap furthest away from the valve and flush it for 30 seconds and then close it up. Additionally, you're also going to want to flush out the drip irrigation filter, which can also get debris in it. So what you would do is you would just unscrew part of the filter, the black piece, and then to manually turn the water on, you would turn the gray valve to get the water to actually bleed through the chamber. So you want to flush that for 30 seconds as well. One thing to keep in mind, be careful with as you're flushing that, moving the flush valve, that gray piece at the bottom of the picture, make sure that you don't fully remove it. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to control the flow of the water as you're flushing things. And at the end of your irrigation season in fall, it's going to be a similar process. You're going to be cleaning out your filters. You're going to be turning off the irrigation at the valve, releasing pressures in valves, closing them off. Closing things off is really important because, you know, if you're not using it, there's no sense in not shutting it off to ensure that nothing else can be leaking if there's a problem. So I really recommend turning things off if you're not using it during the fall and winter, and then also setting that controller to off. Great. So far we've talked about, you know, an overview of different types of irrigation equipment, and we've talked about what we should be doing to prepare for spring and also fall with our irrigation system. And now we're going to talk about what do you actually need for auditing your irrigation system. The good news is you already have it. You know, it's your East Bay mud meter that we talked about at the beginning. Also your senses, you know, walking around the site and looking for issues, hearing any hissing or feeling your ground to see if it's overwatered or, you know, dry spots. So the great thing is you don't need to go to the store and buy something to do an audit. So we'll start with your meter. For auditing purposes, there's only a couple components that you really need to know about. First is the location of your meter. It's going to be located typically directly out front of your house in the sidewalk. And if you use a wrench or a screwdriver to pop off the lid, this is what it's going to look like inside. You'll have a meter, and the first component that I want you to be familiar with is the red flow leak indicator. It's in the shape of a triangle, and it can detect the smallest amounts of water. So if you ever think that there's a leak going on, indoors or outdoors, check your meter when nothing should be running and see if that little triangle is spinning. Because if it is, that does indicate that there's some small amount of water that's being used. The next thing to also look at is the red sweeping hand. This red sweeping hand tracks 1 cubic foot. So 1 revolution of this meter is equal to about 7.5 gallons. And then you also have your car odometer numbers. The white numbers are billing units, which is 100 cubic feet. So that's, you know, 750 gallons. Hopefully your irrigation system isn't using that. But it might also be helpful to look at the black numbers, which represent fractions of cubic feet. But primarily when you're auditing your irrigation system and wanting to know how much water is actually being used in an irrigation session, you really only need to track that red sweeping hand. So to do this, you know, you're going to want to make sure that no water is being used. Take a start read of your meter. You can do this by, you know, taking a photo of it, or putting a little pin or a needle down where that hand is, or just writing exactly all of the numbers out and where the hand is located, and running the irrigation zone for 1 minute. Then you come back and you mark the end read and then do a little bit of math, which we'll show an example in the next slide. So here's an example at my house. So I ran, I did my start read and noted where the red sweeping hand was, which was 0.6. I ran my irrigation for 1 minute, and then I noticed that my red sweeping hand made 1.5 revolutions. So by multiplying that 1.5 revolutions in a minute by 7.48 gallons in a cubic foot is equivalent to 11.22 gallons per minute. So that's how much my irrigation used in a minute. And this can be really helpful information to have, because if this is what I'm seeing on my meter after I run my lawn sprinklers for a minute, this could make sense. But if I have drip irrigation, which is 0.4 gallons per hour, and I see in a minute I've used over 11 gallons, to me that would indicate there's some form of leak going on. So measuring your irrigation zones can be really helpful to know how things are performing or if you've got leaks going on. So another part of auditing your irrigation system, besides looking at your meter and understanding how much water you're using in a irrigation session, would be to turn things on and walk around and see and flag issues. And these are the most common issues that you're going to find. It'll be poor coverage and runoff, high pressure, mixed matched irrigation equipment, spray irrigation in non-suitable areas, and improper controller programming. So the first common issue that you may encounter is runoff. Runoff occurs for a variety of reasons, but typically what's happening is the water is being applied at a rate in which the soil can't accept it. So it's a cup that's overflown, or a sponge that just can't absorb any more water. So instead it runs off. So there's different ways to prevent that from happening. And one example is to see when is the runoff occurring. If I have a lawn on sprinklers, I'm running that for 10 minutes and I see that within 7 minutes there's runoff, I might decide to change those into multiple cycles of 5-minute sessions so that the soil can actually absorb the water, and my lawn can still get the benefit of the same amount of water that it needs to survive. Those nozzles could also be clogged or misaligned, so that would be another thing to adjust and fix. You could also reduce your pressure. And at the end of the day, your main goal is improving your distribution uniformity. So distribution uniformity is water being applied evenly at the same amount of time and rate, so volume as well. And it really looks like head-to-head coverage. It's one sprinkler's throw of water reaching the head of the next sprinkler. So you can see in this bird's eye view, this is an example of poor distribution uniformity, because you can see that these heads aren't reaching all of the grass that it needs to. It's overwatering in some areas, and this can cause a lot of issues, because you can just crank up your irrigation timer for more time, but you're still to irrigate some of the areas that aren't getting enough water, but you're going to be overwatering other areas, and that's why you're seeing circles or brown soggy spots. And the picture below the crop circles is really what it looks like from a worm's eye view, where you're seeing that, some of it's surpassing your lawn's roots needs versus others just aren't meeting it. So it can also create an uneven field underneath as well, not just above ground. And one way to really assess your distribution uniformity is to do a catch can test, which is where you lay cans in a grid form and turn on your irrigation system for a certain amount of time and measure how much water is captured in that can. This is something that's pretty technical and can take a lot of time, so I do recommend, if this is something that you're interested in, having a professional do this for you. The next issue that you could encounter is mixed matched irrigation equipment on the same zone. As you can see in this photo, we have a rotor on the same zone as a sprinkler, and they have different pressure and throw rates. So they're competing with each other, and that's causing some runoff. And as well as some areas that are under irrigated and over irrigated. So this is a difficult zone to manage. So the solution would be to match it up, to have that irrigation zone on the same equipment with the same emitters, so that you're not having pressure competition or areas that are being over underwatered by the design. Another issue that you could see is high pressure. And high pressure looks like misting. It looks like your water, just flying away in the wind, and can also look like runoff as well. But there's two different solutions depending on what the issue is. If the issue that you're experiencing is on all of your irrigation zones, like your sprinklers are misting, your emitters keep popping off of your drip lines, it's probably a good idea to install a pressure regulator on the entire irrigation line and adjusting it between 20 to 40 psi. Again, we had some questions about pressure in the Q&A box, but you're really going to want to use a pressure gauge when your irrigation system is operating to understand what is your pressure in your irrigation line. And then, let's say you end up installing one of these pressure regulators, or you have one. The best way to see what your irrigation system needs is really fine tuning, running the system while adjusting that screw on the top, and seeing at what point are the droplets, the right size, are they accurately irrigating that area. We also have a rebate available for pressure regulators as well. And if you're seeing that the misting, the overspray is only on one specific zone, probably just means that you need to reduce your pressure on it. And you can do that by installing high efficiency nozzles, as well as pressure regulating sprinkler bodies. As we talked about before, they operate at a much higher PSI, but emit water at a slower precipitation rate. So that means that you're going to be irrigating longer, but you're going to be having larger droplets actually reaching the roots of your lawn. We also have rebates available for this type of equipment as well. The next type of issue that you could see is spray irrigation in non-suitable places. So what makes this a non-suitable place is, the area is pretty narrow, less than 2 feet. You've got a wall that's probably also being irrigated, and you have different plant types with different needs, different heights. This is just a really tricky spot to irrigate. So you would definitely want to make some adjustments. So as I would think, if you've got a narrow space to irrigate, you also need a narrow form of irrigation. And that could either be cutting out that automatic irrigation and hand watering, or converting spray to drip, which we also provide a rebate for. So for converting spray to drip, the nice thing is you can work with what you have existing. Essentially, you take your furthest away sprinkler head, you remove the sprinkler, and then you put in a riser. After that riser, you're going to want to put on some form of drip, drip emitter cap. And then you're going to want to cap all the other sprinklers on that zone so that they're not running at the same time. So you just put a little end cap on them. And don't forget, at the beginning of the valve, you want to make sure that there is a pressure regulator and a filter. So those are just the simple, little components, tweaks that you can make to what you already have existing to make something more appropriate. And sometimes the issue is just a really tricky area to irrigate due to poor design. Here we've got, a lawn in a really small area in weird shapes. There's high pressure coming from those sprinklers. So this would be, this would just be a really hard site to manage. And this would be something I would recommend, applying for our lawn conversion rebate program to be able to manage that area better.
Okay, so we're going to be moving on to our controller, but we just wanted to get an idea of what are you doing with your controller? How often do you adjust it? And if you wouldn't mind just taking a second to fill that in, daily, monthly. The controller adjusts itself. It's weather-based, 1 to 2 times a year. No controller, I hand water. I see the results coming in. And we'll just give this a couple more seconds. Okay, it looks like 1 to 2 times a year is the winner, and then no controller, and then monthly you have a controller that self-adjusts, and then daily. Someone actually does their that we can share the results here.
Great. Looks like we have a variety of different levels or habits or types of irrigation controllers. So let's talk about how to make sure your controller is programmed the best that it can be and that you're checking it the right amount of times and making adjustments as needed. So when you're doing your irrigation audit, some issues that you could find with your controller is poor scheduling, and we'll get more into details with that later, wrong time settings. Maybe it's set to AM when it's actually 7 p.m. or having multiple programs serving the same irrigation zone. You're going to want to make sure you're checking your program A, B, and C, and make sure that things aren't set on there so that you're not doubly irrigating that same zone. Another issue is also your controller settings returning to their standard, which would typically be a summer July setting after a power outage. So that's why it's important to have your backup batteries in there so that things don't go back to July when it's, November when PG&E is shutting our power off. And one solution, if you really like your hands-on controller, you like being able to interact with it and check it, I would say, mapping out your irrigation zones as you're doing your audit so you understand which zone goes to which area. And also using your gallons per minute reads that you found from your meter auditing to just have that all in a list so that you know what to look for when you're walking around. And then adjusting that controller monthly by referring to that watering guide that we'll be sending out, and then tweaking it as needed. So an example of what poor scheduling could look like is, let's say it's October, you should be irrigating 2 days per week, and your irrigation controller is set to 3 to 4 days per week. Or maybe you're not doing enough cycles. You can see this irrigation schedule guide has different cycles with different amounts of times, because you want to make sure that you're allowing enough time for that water to actually penetrate and permeate through the soil and reach your plant's roots, as opposed to running off. So it's really important to make sure that you're timing things in certain increments, as well as cycling them. Slow it, spread it, sink it. You hear that with with your rainwater, but you also want to do that with your potable, your irrigation water that you're applying as well. And if that seems a little bit too hand-on, you can also take the guesswork out of scheduling and install a smart controller that will adjust based off of local weather data. You can even get it to be more localized by installing a soil or rain sensor and then connecting that to your controller as well. One thing that I do want to mention about smart controllers is that they do require some form of interaction. You don't want to set it and forget it. You do want to make sure that things are still being programmed correctly and that it's doing what your plant's needs actually are. We also have a rebate available for this type of equipment. So as we've talked about, a variety of different solutions for problems, a lot of them come with upgrades that we offer rebates for. Lawn conversion, drip conversion, smart controller, putting in those high efficiency nozzles, or a pressure regulator to reduce that misting and overspray that you might be seeing. Or maybe you just want to get a better understanding of how much water you're using and installing an irrigation submeter. But there are requirements and certain needs that we have. So I do recommend, before you go out and buy things and apply, read the rebate requirements first and research before you buy, and think critically about what your project needs are. For example, if you have high pressure on your entire irrigation system, does it make sense to just do the high efficiency sprinkler nozzles, or should you also be installing that brass pressure regulator? So really thinking, big picture, how are these different components going to work together and resolve the issues, or give you that sense of, control of your irrigation that you need. And then seeking an expert's advice when you need it. And for doing that research, you want to go to ebmud.com/rebates. And then some helpful resources that we have to help you get started: that lawn and landscaping watering guide that we have, our hiring a landscaper guide, our Water Smart Gardener Center, and your local irrigation store. And to get to the Water Smart Gardener Center, which is our East Bay Mud encyclopedia of, water conservation in the garden, you go to ebmud.com/watersmart. So in the past almost hour, we've talked about quite a variety of different things. We've reviewed the irrigation components, basic and advanced, the different types of irrigation that you might see on your individual valves. We've talked about the different types of drip irrigation and when they're appropriate for certain situations, how to audit your irrigation system, what you need to do in spring and fall. Also common irrigation problems and solutions, and learning how to use your meter to help you understand how much water is being used and finding leaks, and then wrapping it all up in a bow with different irrigation rebates or resources to help you after you leave this webinar from us today.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. We have a number of questions in the queue, so we will take a few minutes to answer questions. If you are heading out now, please do fill out the evaluation. That really helps us, and do remember that we're here to help you, the whole water conservation team, with any of your water conservation questions. So let's see. I have a bed of plants under an eave of my house that doesn't get any direct rain. How do I water this zone?
So where is, could you repeat that one again? I was trying to find it in the questions.
Oh, I went down to the bottom.
Okay, we're at the bottom.
Yeah, I have a bed of plants under an eave of my house that doesn't get any direct rain. You would
How to water this zone?
drip irrigation or
hand watering. It really depends on what type of plants they are and how well established they are. I would need to be a little bit more detailed to provide a good answer for that.
Yeah, because you don't want too many plants right up against your house. You want to give your house a little breathing room from plants being too close for a number of reasons. But yeah, that might be a good spot for hand watering, or potentially some drip, or really having plants that are shade loving and also drought tolerant, that don't need a lot of water.
I see another question that I'd like to answer, because we're sending out that lawn and watering schedule. Timing, what's the difference between cycles and duration on, irrigation scheduling? So a cycle would be, how many times a day you are running that irrigation zone, and the duration would be the amount of time. So if I have a lawn that requires me to irrigate it for 15 minutes, that's what my lawn's needs are. But I decide to do 3 cycles. Those 3 cycles would each have a duration of 5 minutes. So when you're setting it up on the controller, the duration is just the amount of time during that one instance. It's not going to know what the overall added amount of time and water that's being applied. That's what you would have to do. You're literally just, unless you have a smart controller, you're telling it exactly what it needs to do and how much. And that's the importance of understanding the difference between the cycles and the duration. Another question I see, I bought my smart controller in July last year. Can I still apply for the rebate? Unfortunately, our rebates are not retroactive, which is why I encourage everyone to do their research before installing things, because it's an incentive program, so it does need to be managed, and we do need to make sure that things are meeting all of the requirements.
What is the best time to water the lawn in summer versus spring versus fall for hot areas like San Ramon, Danville? I see some people water at night and others water in the early day.
And this is just what I've heard. In terms of is it better to irrigate in the beginning of the morning, 5 a.m. or late at night, 12 a.m. That doesn't really differ that much from what I've heard, but what I would say is probably more important is to think about when is it, when are you more likely to have wind? Like if you live in an area that has really windy evenings, probably irrigating earlier in the morning would be more preferable.
I have a drip irrigation in my garden. could you explain more about how the drip leak finder works? Is it installed all around the garden at different points or just one valve?
My understanding is you would only need to install it on, each individual valve, because essentially that drip leak indicator is its own little emitter. So if any, as water is going through that drip line, it's going to activate that leak indicator to mist. So if it's, if you have a leak on any area on that drip line, that water is going to be moving through that drip tube. So that one should be sufficient. So you really only need one per valve on the drip.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Is there anything you see that you want to answer there, Lindsay?
Someone said, where can I find an evaluation form? I believe we'll be emailing that out.
Yeah.
Okay,
with newer controllers, is it possible to attach flow monitors? Are there any recommendations from EBMUD around these devices to find leaks?
So we do have a flow meter rebate, and it's going to actually be talked about in our leak detection webinar
next Thursday.
Next Thursday, and we don't have like a specific one that we recommend, but it really depends on what your needs really are. If you're really just concerned about your irrigation line as a whole, maybe installing a flow meter on that irrigation line, or getting some form of a flow sensor to be able to detect things. You can also decide that you want to look at things on a bigger scale and know how much you're using in a day at your entire house, and maybe you want a flow meter on your house line, which is also going to show your irrigation, and that can be helpful in the sense of, if when you're irrigating, if I'm running my lawn sprinklers for 15 minutes at 6 a.m. on Mondays and Fridays, and you take a look at your flow meters, water portal to see how much water is being used, you can get a good sense of, if things are leaking or how much water is being used. So it really depends on, how deep in the weeds you want to get, or what type of information you're looking for. But if you go to ebmud.com/rebates, there'll be some information in our flow meter rebate program, which could be of interest to you as well.
There's a question here. Can rodents create destruction to drip lines?
Absolutely. So that's, they can definitely chew through things, but I will also say that, we can also do that, accidentally on our own too, with, raking and whatnot. So it's really important to audit your irrigation system and do a walk around to see or hear where those drip lines could be having issues. So, or even getting those little drip leak indicators. So, rodents can definitely chew through them, but so can dogs and people using rakes and other equipment. So that's why it's good to do periodic walkthroughs to find those issues before they find you on your bill.
Okay, thank you so much, Lindsay and Rolando, and thank you everyone for participating today. We are sending you a follow-up email, which you should get by early next week, with the PowerPoint presentation and the video and helpful links, including the schedule. People asked about that. We will be sending the scheduling out. So with that, have a great weekend. We're almost there. And thank you again for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for spending your lunch with us. We really appreciate it.